What it do, what's poppin', everybody? Welcome to Straight Talk TV. Thank y'all for tuning in. If you haven't already, do me a big solid. Hit that subscribe button for me, y'all. Tap that little bell notification icon so you get notified with the latest content, updates, and information from me, Straight Talk TV. Yeah, hit that like button. Let YouTube know you're rocking with this here content and you want to see more of it. Yeah. Let's jump right into this. Man, we got Tory Lanez, Daystar Peterson, you know what I'm saying, is his former name, on tap for the day. And his bodyguard has made an affidavit that completely contradicts everything Meagan Thee Stallion has said pertaining to Tory Lanez, Mr. Daystar Peterson, in this case. Now we know Tory Lanez has already been convicted, but he's appealing his conviction, and he's fighting for his freedom. And his bodyguard has did a affidavit, and it has been released, and his bodyguard name is Joaquin Smith, and he said that he has firsthand knowledge of the facts in question that took place on July 12th, 2020. That is the basis of this affidavit. And y'all notice he said he has firsthand knowledge. That means that he was there. He said that he was the driver and bodyguard for Tory Lanez, who is, formerly known as Mr. Daystar Peterson. And he said on July of 2020, he was his bodyguard, and he had known him for 7 years at the time of the incident. He had worked for Mr. Peterson for 3 years. He has not only been my employer, but I also consider him to be a close personal friend. He said on July 12, 2020, he was asked to drive Mr. Peterson to the home of Kylie Jenner, where Mrs. Meagan Pete and Kelsey Harris were present. Mr. Peterson was at Mrs. Jenner's home for approximately 2 hours when he received a call to come pick up Mrs. Pete and Mrs. Harris. He said Mrs. Pete and Mrs. Harris and myself left Mrs. Jenner's home, but I was asked by Mrs. Pete to return because she stated that she had forgotten a shoe. When we arrived at Mrs. Jenner's home at the time, Mrs. Harris stayed in the car while Mrs. Pete exited. Mrs. Pete did not enter the home at this time, as she went around the back to the pool area where Mr. Peterson was located. Both Mrs. Pete and Mr. Peterson returned to the car after a few minutes. Mrs. Pete was bickering, but I am unsure of the exact words she was saying. She seemed upset. The four of us left Mrs. Jenner's residence. As I began to drive, Mrs. Pete started to fight with Mr. Peterson. They were going back and forth. I remember Mr. Peterson saying to Miss Pete that he was going to tell Miss Harris what was going on. I don't remember what street we were on, but Mrs. Pete asked me to stop the vehicle. I did as she asked, and Mrs. Pete went on to sit on a nearby bus stop. Mr. Peterson went and spoke with Miss Pete After about 2 minutes, they returned to the car and I began driving again. Mrs. Pete started to argue again, and Mrs. Harris asked what was going on. Mr. Peterson told her that he and Miss Pete had been dating and intimate. Miss Harris was upset by this, as she and Mr. Peterson had been dating in the same manner prior to any relationship with Mrs. Pete. Mrs. Pete and Miss Harris began fighting. I pulled over to stop them. Mrs. Pete and Mrs. Harris both got out of the vehicle and continued to fight, both verbally and physically. I broke up this fight and was pulling Mrs. Pete towards the back of the car. I saw Mrs. Harris with a gun in her hand. Mr. Peterson ran from behind Mrs. Pete and myself towards Mrs. Harris. Mr. Peterson and Miss Harris began struggling as Mr. Peterson tried to unarm Miss Harris. I was still pulling Miss Pete and did not see who shot the weapon. I was lucky I was not harmed, and in my opinion, Mrs. Pete was also fortunate. The whole incident happened so quickly within just a couple of minutes. I saw Mrs. Harris with the gun in her hand. Mrs. Peterson ran from behind Mrs. Pete and myself towards Mrs. Harris. Mr. Peterson and Miss Harris began struggling as Mr. Peterson tried to unarm Mrs. Harris. I was pulling Mrs. Pete and did not see who shot the weapon. I was lucky I was not harmed, and in my opinion, Mrs. Pete was also fortunate. The whole incident happened so quickly within just a couple of minutes. I wanted to present this evidence during Mr. Peterson's trial, but was prevented from doing so as the district attorney was not ready to cross-examine me, and later they did not call me due to the holidays and the court schedule. I believe I should have been allowed to present this evidence at trial. Respectfully submitted, the 5th day of December 2023 by Joaquin Smith. So there y'all have it. This is the bodyguard of Mr. Tory Lanez. He was there and present that night. He clearly said that Mrs. Harris was the one who produced the firearm, and Mr. Peterson, which is Tory Lanez, he only tried to disarm Mrs. Harris. He said that he seen Mr. Peterson, which is Tory Lanez, run from behind him and Mrs. Pete, which is Meagan the Stallion. He ran from behind both of them towards Mrs. Harris and struggled with her, trying to disarm her. So we know, per witness account, that Tory Lanez was trying to disarm Mrs. Harris. We know that Mrs. Harris is the one who produced the firearm. And, Tory Lanez's bodyguard is not the only one who said this. Y'all remember during the trial, there was a witness who was on the second floor balcony directly across the street from where all of this took place. And he said basically the same exact thing as this bodyguard who was the driver that night. He's saying basically the same exact thing, that the shots came from the direction of the female. He saw flashes of light coming from the direction that the female was in, not Tory Lanez. So this is two witnesses that are basically giving the same testimony to the court. So, look like we finna have some more drama coming out of this Tory Lanez and Meagan the Stallion situation. So y'all keep it locked, stay tuned. You know what I'm saying? For all of the updates, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit that little bell notification icon. Click all so you get all the notifications with all the latest updates and information. Hit that like button. Let YouTube know you rocking with this here content and you want to see more of it. You know what I'm saying? Appreciate you guys for tuning in, and I will catch you guys on the next go round. Straight Talk is out.